Okay, hello GameMakers, this is GameMaker Rob, and today I'm going to show you part 1 of creating a JRPG cutscene using sequences in GameMaker. This episode is going to be mainly me talking about the reasons why I did things and showing it off, and a little bit of code, and then in the second part we're just going to dive into the code and build everything that you would need. So right now the character is in like a main room, and what we're going to see is we're going to be going to the same room 3 times, and the first 2 times we're going to see a different cutscene play, and then the final time there's going to be no cutscene because our story point has gone beyond that. I'm basically using a global variable, and inside the sequences I'm using a moment at the end of the sequence to just run a script to increase that value by 1, and then I have an array storing sequences based on the rooms, based on different story values, and that's how the game knows what to play. So anyway, let me show you this now. So press F5. This is the first sequence. One thing I didn't show you is the player can move before and after sequences. So right now I can't move. This is talking text, and right now the sequence is paused, which is one of the main reasons I used objects over sprites. So the sequence is playing again after I press enter or space, and now this first sequence is finished. I can move around as the player. If I press F5 and back to the start room, I can move around, go back to the throne room. This is the second sequence. I can't move right now. Let's get through the sequence. And there we go. So that's the second sequence. I can move again, go back to the main room, back to the throne room. And then this is the same room, but because there is no sequence in the array entry for this story point and for this room, then no sequence plays. So why and how I made the sequences. So I wanted to have interactive text boxes, which means that I needed to pause sequences whilst waiting for player input. And when a sequence is paused, any animating sprites within the sequence also pause, which was one of the main reasons I decided to use objects inside sequences instead of sprites. The next thing I needed was to make the objects change their sprites when they change direction or want to do some other kind of animation, for example. Broadcast messages was the best fit for this, as you can send a string to an object and then have that object do whatever you like based upon that string. I'm just using one single object that takes all of the broadcast messages, and then that object tells other things what to do, basically. I can use the same messages from using broadcast to stop and start music, play sound effects, have the screen shake, change the font in talking text, and anything you can kind of imagine, you can do through strings. So broadcast was really useful for that. I also used moments, which allows you to run a script, but you can't pass any arguments, which is a bit of a bummer. So I used moments to increase the story value, like I said, which is part of the reason how the game knows which cutscene to play. And I have a 2D array with it's as long as there are many rooms, and there are as many entries in it for as many story points there are as well. I just have every entry as a default of -1, meaning no cutscene, and then manually overwrite it so it knows which cutscene to play. What I didn't tackle, potential problems you may face. I couldn't find a good way to tackle depth in sequences. In fact, I didn't make much of an attempt at all, and it probably won't even be an issue for you if all your sprites are the same size as the tiles. It's only if you have something like in this demo where the sprites are taller than the tile sizes. I also don't account for the player not being in the correct tile when activating the cutscene. What if the player is facing the wrong way too? My idea to get around this would be to have some code run in between touching the cutscene activator and the cutscene actually playing. But like I said, I did not tackle that. Sometimes, even though I foresee problems, I don't tackle them because I think it's extra complexity, which isn't always needed for many people. So that's the main reason. And my final thoughts, sequences can be a really useful tool, and if you take heed of the limitations of this tutorial, the way that I show you should allow you to have dozens, hundreds of cutscenes easily. Cutscenes are not something you just want to add on at the end though, unless you really have to. At least be thinking about how you will implement cutscenes from the start of making your game, even if you don't make them straight away. So now we're going to get on with making a sequence of some code, and part 2 will be out next week. Okay, so I'm going to start by showing you the sprites that I have. For the characters, here is the player. We have a down animation, and we have left, right, and up. And then the same for the NPC. He has down, left, right, and up. And then we have a text box for the text using 9 slicing. You don't have to use 9 slicing, I just decided to do it that way. We have a sprite for an object that's going to detect when the player is over it, or actually the player is going to detect it, and that's what's going to trigger a cutscene. You don't always have to trigger cutscenes like that, it's just how I'm doing it. And then we have a sprite for the throne room, and the size of this sprite is 237 by 316. And as you can see in my room, I've made the width and height of the room the same as the sprite, just to make it, easy to deal with. I don't know why it's any easier to deal with though. Anyway, I'm also using a viewport, so enable viewports visible, and again the same width and height of the sprite, and I'm just timesing that by 3 to get a viewport to play with. And I think that's everything for the setup. And the next thing we're going to do is make 2 objects, obj player, obj NPC. There's no code inside them. All I've done is given them an appropriate down sprite. So this is the player, this is the NPC. And the next thing we're going to do is make a sequence. Okay, so now we're going to make a sequence. Hopefully you can see this in the video. Yeah, cool. So I'm going to call this sequence throne room 1. And then I'm just going to drag in the sprites for the throne room. This point here is 0, 0. So I just want to make sure that the origin for this sprite matched up there as well. Just going to click it there. There we go, awesome. And then, so for this to work, for the cutscenes to work seamlessly, the actors the actors in the room, which we're going to add in a minute, need to be in the same position as they start in the cutscene. So I'm going to put the player down here. He wants to, his position wants to be 112272, like that. And then the NPC wants to be up here. Let's check his position, 11296, that's perfect. And then in the room itself, I'm going to again place those same characters, just check his, 11296 for this guy, and for the player 112272. Awesome. I'm using a grid size of 16, which matches the tile size and I'm using snap to make positioning easy. So basically in every sequence I'm going to do today, this is going to be the starting position of the NPCs and the player. We'd want the player to start facing up, but we're going to tackle that in the sequence, so that's not to worry about. I mean, if the player had just moved into this room, you'd assume he would be facing upwards, but I'm just going to, I'm not going to assume that. I'm just going to use code to make sure he is facing the right way. So anyway, let's do something with the sequence now. Okay, so all I'm going to do, I'm just going to have the player walk up towards the NPC. What this is going to be a test for is just to make sure that after the sequence is done, even though the player hasn't moved the character themselves, we want the player to end up wherever the cut scene finishes. So that's what we're going to do now. So what is... Oh, the NPC only started there. That's not good. I made a mistake placing the NPC. Let me just delete the NPC. No, I don't need to delete him. I'm just going to drag it down here. And then delete this key. Oh, it's the wrong thing. Never mind. Let me just delete the guy. And then make sure the track is starting at the very start. And then drag him in. Still not 100% with this. With sequences. There we go. Cool. Let me just do a test and play the sequence from start to finish. Awesome. I'm going to make the sequence double length because I want the player to walk all the way to the top. So now we're going to make sure all of our tracks extend to the full 120. So I'm going to right click and stretch for the NPC, right click and stretch for the player, right click and stretch for the throne room. We don't need to display the throne room during the sequence. This is just for making sure we have things in the right position. And also right clicking and using stretch is a lot safer than just dragging and doing this, because you can miss like the last few pixels or something. So it's just safer to stretch it like that. Anyway, so what we want is at the end of the sequence, we want the player to end up here. So I've just dragged him. You can see one problem with the way sequences work right now is depth order is based on the order of the actors. So right now the NPC is drawn over the player. So we're just going to move the player to the top track to avoid that. This isn't a problem if you have sprites that are the same size as the grid, but if you're using sprites like this, then it may cause you some issues you have to get around, but this is one way to deal with it. Oh, that was a mistake. There we go. Alright, okay, cool. Alright, so now if we play the sequence, we should be able to see the player move upwards. There we go. It's fine, he's moving backwards. The thing with using objects in sequences is he's always just going to be using the sprite that he started with. And we're going to change it using broadcast messages, but not yet. So anyway, so this is our sequence right now. So if let's just go into the throne room. We're going to make a new object. I'm actually going to add an object. Okay, so all I've done is I've added an object called obj activate cutscene, this one here, and it needs the sprite activate cutscene sprite so we can see it. And in the throne room, I'm going to place this asset here. So the player is going to start with collision. I have tested it though, and It doesn't matter where you place it, as long as the player moves into it. Whenever the player finishes moving to that tile, it's going to activate. But we're going to have to do some code now, so let's get into that. Okay, so I have just used a bare bones of code just for now, just to show you how override is going to work before we get into the meat of everything. So in the player, we have a step event. All we're going to do is we're going to check for collision with the cutscene activation object. If there is a cutscene object, we're just going to destroy it, which is going to run that cutscene object's destroy event. And then I'm also going to allow the player to move left and right with the left and right keys. So you'll see how that works in a minute. Yeah. And then in the activate cutscene object in this destroy event, this code is going to be very similar to the final code we're going to use in another object. But for now, let's just put it here. So all we're going to do is when this object is destroyed, we're going to create an instance of our sequence using this line here. We then want to know, okay, what objects does this sequence have inside it? So to do that, we have to use this function to get the sequence instance, and then we have to use sequence get to be able to get the objects, which is going to give us an array. And then we're going to go through this array entry by entry to get the object. And then when you first create the sequence, the objects for that sequence don't get created straight away, i.e. that step. So right now, at this point here, the sequence objects haven't been created. So if an instance of the object exists, that means there must already be one of them in the room. Then we're going to use instance find to get the first instance of that object, which presumably is going to be the one that we want to override with, i.e. obj player, something like that. So get the first instance and save it inside this variable, and then we're going to use sequence instance override object to override the sequence object with the room object. This might seem pretty complicated for what it's supposed to do, and you might wonder why we're doing it here. There's a couple of points. So if you check the manual page for sequence instance override object, you'll see that you cannot override objects before the sequence has started to play. You can't override the objects beforehand. You just have to have the sequence. You have to have an instance of the sequence created, and then before that plays, you have to override them. So it's a little bit more complicated than I would have liked. But the other thing as well, the reason why because we know which objects are in the sequence, right? We can just like type them, override this object with this object. But what I'm building is code that should work for you regardless of what objects are in what sequence. So that's the point of making it a little bit more complex, because in an RPG you're not just going to have a few cutscenes, you're going to have 10, 20, 30. So the point being, as your game scales, this code doesn't get any harder at all. It should be the same. It should work the same. Okay, so now we have done that. Let's run the game. Make sure we can see this in the video. There we go, cool. So as you can see, the sequence is played. I can press left and right and move the player. So this is, the sequence is done now. It's not working anymore, but I can now move the player. If I run the game again, I'm going to mess with the controls while the sequence runs, and you'll see why we need to stop the player. So, oops. Let me try again. I wasn't ready. So, you can see that there's a lot. I can wiggle the player while he's moving. So, we're going to be using a state system. So either the player can move or we're playing a cutscene. And I would highly advise you to not have a separate state system for the player and for the game. And even the code that I've done, I've kind of realized, you know what, one state system could have worked for everything. I'm just in the habit of making different state systems for different objects, but really, the more you can use one state system for everything, it makes things a lot simpler. So now I've shown you how override works, we're going to get into the rest of the code. We're going to build something from scratch using some of the code we've already used, but the end point, like I said, is we'll end up with something that will scale really well no matter how big your game is.